Get Paul.
Then there's Stanislaus Kaczynski, Albert
Yeah,
Kolb,
Paul
Mueller,
Kantorek, the teacher,
Kantorek,
Himmelstoss,
Kemmerich, Joseph Ben,
Kimrick,
Dieterich,
Mueller,
Duval, Lair, Hyavestus,
Cat.
Kinderwater,
All right, how about you just tell me when I get to it?
Lewandowski, and Mittelstadt.
All Quiet on the Western Front by a German man. It's narrated by Paul Baumer, a young man of 19 who fights in the German army on the French front in World War I. Paul and several of his friends from school joined the army voluntarily after listening to the stirring patriotic speeches of their teacher, Kantorek. But after experiencing 10 weeks of brutal training at the hands of Corporal Himmelstoss and unimaginable brutality of life on the front, Paul and his friends have realized that the ideas of nationalism and patriotism for which they enlisted are simply empty cliches. They no longer believe that war is glorious or honorable, and they live in constant terror.
Yes, same here.
When Paul's company receives a short reprieve after 2 weeks of fighting, only 80 men of the original 150 company return from the front. The cook doesn't want to give the survivors the rations that they were meant for the dead men, but eventually agrees to do so, and the men thus enjoy a large meal. Paul and his friends visit Kimrick, a former classmate who has recently had his leg amputated after contracting gangrene.
Yeah.
Gangrene? Kimrick is slowly dying, and Mueller, who is another classmate, wants Kimrick's boots for himself. Paul doesn't consider Mueller insensitive like the other soldiers. Mueller simply realizes pragmatically that Kimrick no longer needs his boots because he's only got one leg. Surviving the agony of war, Paul observes surviving the agony of war, Paul observes forces. This is a weird sentence. Paul observes forces one to learn to disconnect oneself from emotions like grief, sympathy, and fear. No longer after this encounter, Paul returns to Kimrick's bedside just as the young man dies. At Kimrick's request, Paul takes his boots to Mueller. A group of new recruits comes to reinforce the company, and Paul's friend Kat produces a beef and bean stew that impresses them. Kat says that if all the men in an army, including the officers, were paid the same wage and given the same food, wars would be over immediately. Kropp, another one of Paul's former classmates, says that there should be no armies. He argues that the nation's leaders should fight out their disagreements with clubs. They discuss the fact that petty, insignificant people become powerful and arrogant during war, and Chaden, a member of Paul's company, announces that Corporal Himmelstoss has come to fight at the front. At night, the men go on a harrowing mission to lay barbed wire at the front. Pounded by artillery, they hide in a graveyard where the force of shelling causes the buried corpses to emerge from their graves, as a group of living men fall dead around them. After the gruesome event, the surviving soldiers return to their camp where they kill lice and think about what they will do at the end of the war. Some of the men had tentative plans, but they all seem to feel that the war will never end. Paul fears that if the war did end, he just wouldn't know what to do with himself, fearing that he has lost the part of him that will be able to return from war. Himmelstoss arrives at the front, and when the men see him, Jaden insults him. The men's lieutenant gives them light punishment, but also lectures Himmelstoss about the futility of saluting at the front. Paul and Kat find a house with a goose and roast the goose for supper, enjoying a rare and good meal. That was one of the few times that Paul was actually... The company is caught in a bloody battle with a charging group of allied infantrymen. Men are blown apart, limbs are severed from torsos, and giant rats pick at the dead and the wounded. And Paul feels that he must become an animal in battle, trusting only his instincts to keep him alive. After the battle, only 32 of the 80 men are still alive. Men are given a short reprieve at a field depot, and Paul and some of his friends go for a swim, which end in a rendezvous with a group of French girls. Paul desperately wishes to recapture his innocence with the girl, but he feels it is impossible to do so. Paul receives 17 days of leave and goes home to see his family. He feels awkward and oppressed in his hometown, unable to discuss his traumatic experiences with everyone because everyone back home is still romanticizing the idea of war. He learns that his mother is dying of cancer and that Kantarek has been conscripted as a soldier from which he deserves a certain cold satisfaction. He visits Kimrick's mother, who died earlier in the book, and tells her untruthfully that her son's death was instant and painless, unlike what we had learned earlier. At the end of his leave, Paul spends some time at a training camp near a group of Russian prisoners of war. Paul feels that the Russians are people just like him and not subhuman enemies that was pounded in his head in training, and wonders how war can make enemies of people who have no grudge against one another. Paul is sent back to his company and reunited with his friends. The Kaiser, the German emperor, pays a visit to the front, and the men are disappointed to see that he is merely a short man with a weak voice. In battle, Paul is separated from his company and forced to hide in a shell hole. A French soldier jumps into the hole with him, and Paul instinctively stabs him. As the man dies a slow, painful death, Paul is overcome with remorse for having hurt him. He feels again that his enemy soldier is no enemy at all, but rather a victim of war just like himself. Paul looks through the soldier's things and finds that his name was Gerard Duval, and learns that Duval had a wife and a child at home. When he returns to his company, Paul recounts the incidents to his friends, who try to console him by telling him, "You need to move on and not linger on it too much." Paul and his friends are given an easy assignment for 3 weeks, and they are to guard a supply depot away from the fighting. When the next battle takes place, Paul and Kropp are wounded and forced to bribe a sergeant major with cigars in order to be placed in the hospital train together. At the hospital, Paul undergoes surgery and Kropp's leg is amputated, and he becomes extremely depressed. After the surgery, Paul has a short leave at home before he returns to his company. As the German army begins to give into the unrelenting pressure of the Allied forces, Paul's friends are killed in combat one by one. Dietering, one of Paul's close friends, attempts to desert but is caught and court-martialed. Cat is killed when a piece of shrapnel slices his head open while Paul is trying to carry him to safety. By the fall of 1918, Paul is the only one in his circle of friends who is still alive. Soldiers everywhere whisper that Germans will soon surrender and that peace will come. Paul is poisoned in a gas attack and is given a short leave. He reflects that when the war ends, he will be ruined for peacetime because all he knows is the war. In October 1918, on a day with very little fighting, Paul is killed. The army report for that day simply, "All quiet on the Western Front." Paul's corpse wears a calm expression, as though relieved that the end has come at last.
Yes. He did a lot of work exposing PTSD before anybody realized what PTSD was.
I think it was one of the best war novels I've ever read.
Yeah.
And the thing is that the author of this book served in World War I. Mm-hmm. So even though this book is fiction, I'm sure most of what he writes in the book is stuff that he saw as his time in the military as a German soldier, because I read up on the bio of him. He was injured like 5 times before he was finally taken out of battle. So it's a very eye-opening experience for most people who try to like romanticize the idea of war. To know that there's gonna be a lot of death around you, and half the time as a young person you can't, it's hard for some people to come back from that.
Nobody comes back from that unchanged.
Unchanged, no one comes back from that. So if you do, you're a freak of nature.
If you do, it's because you're dead.
If you come back from that chain unchanged, it's because you're a helpless case. I thought it was a really, really good book, and I feel like everybody should
It is
Read it.
genuinely one of the best I've ever gone through.
For sure. The Netflix movie was trash.
The Netflix movie wasn't bad. It just didn't need that name.
No, they could have done like something completely different.
Yeah,
it
would've
was
been fine
not
with
all
that.
quiet on the Western Front. It was all loud on the Eastern back. Good book though. Definitely give it a read. It's also another short one.